In a small, quiet town surrounded by green hills and thick forests, there lived a man named Daniel. He wasn't the kind of person who stood out in a crowd. In fact, most people barely noticed him, unless they needed his help. Daniel was a mechanic, and he worked at a tiny garage on the edge of town. His hands were always covered in grease, and his clothes smelled faintly of oil, but no one cared about that. What mattered was that Daniel could fix anything. Cars, trucks, even old tractors that had been left to rust for years. People often said that if something had wheels, Daniel could bring it back to life. Despite his talent, Daniel kept to himself. He didn't go to parties or hang out at the local bar like everyone else. Instead, he spent most of his time working, reading books, or taking long walks through the forest behind his house. Some people thought he was strange, while others simply assumed he liked being alone. But the truth was, Daniel had secrets. Secrets he'd carried with him for years. Secrets that made him want to stay away from people and avoid attention. Daniel's life might have gone on like this forever. Quiet, predictable, and uneventful, if not for one fateful evening. That night, as he walked home from work along a dimly lit road, 4 men stepped out of the shadows. They were part of a gang that had recently moved into the area, and their reputation was already well known. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were bullies who thrived on intimidation. And tonight they had picked Daniel as their target. "Hey you," one of them shouted, stepping forward. "We've heard about you. You're good with cars, right?" Daniel stopped walking and looked at them cautiously. "Yes," he replied calmly. "What do you need?" The leader of the group smirked. "We've got a car that needs fixing, stolen obviously. We don't care where it came from, we just want it running again. You'll do it for us, won't you?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry," he said firmly. "I don't work on stolen property. I don't ask questions when I fix cars, but I also don't break the law." For a moment the men stared at him in disbelief, then laughter erupted among them. It was harsh and mocking, filled with disdain. One of them stepped closer, shoving Daniel hard enough to make him stumble backward. "You think you're better than us?" The man sneered. "Who do you think you are?" "I'm nobody," Daniel answered quietly, regaining his balance. "But I still won't help you." That answer only made the men angrier. Their laughter turned into curses, and before Daniel could react, they lunged at him. Fists flew, striking him repeatedly. Pain exploded across his face and ribs as he tried to shield himself, but it was no use. There were too many of them, and they showed no mercy. Each punch felt heavier than the last until finally Daniel collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The men stood over him, panting and grinning. "That's what happens when you cross us," the leader spat. "Next time, maybe you'll learn to keep your mouth shut." With that, they left him lying there, bruised and bleeding, as if he were nothing more than trash. The streetlights flickered above him, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. For a long time, Daniel lay motionless, staring up at the dark sky. His body ached, but it wasn't the physical pain that weighed on him the most. It was the realization that these men had chosen him because they saw him as weak, an easy target. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As the minutes passed, Daniel forced himself to sit up. Every movement sent sharp jolts of pain through his body, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. Slowly, he got to his feet and began limping toward home. With each step, a strange feeling grew inside him, a mix of anger, determination, and something else he couldn't quite name. By the time he reached his apartment, his mind was racing with thoughts he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. For so long, Daniel had hidden from his past, burying it beneath layers of normalcy. He had chosen this quiet life because he believed it was safer than the world he had left behind. But now, as he stood in his tiny kitchen, wiping blood from his split lip, he realized that safety was an illusion. No matter how far he ran or how much he tried to disappear, trouble always found him, and this time he wasn't going to let it win. Little did those men know they had just awakened something within Daniel, something powerful and dangerous. They thought they had taught him a lesson, but in reality, they had set off a chain of Events that would change everything for them, for the town, and for Daniel himself. The morning after the attack, Daniel woke up to a dull ache that seemed to radiate from every part of his body. His face was swollen. His ribs felt tender with each breath, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he stared at the cracked mirror across the room. The reflection staring back at him looked unfamiliar, bruised, battered, but somehow different. There was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of something unyielding. For years, Daniel had buried his past so deeply that even he sometimes forgot it existed. He had grown accustomed to living a life of simplicity, finding comfort in routine and solitude. But now, as memories flooded back like an unstoppable tide, he couldn't ignore them any longer. Those men who had attacked him, they thought they were dealing with just another ordinary man, someone too weak to fight back. They didn't know about the world Daniel had once belonged to. And maybe, just maybe, it was time they found out. Daniel's phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling him out of his thoughts. It was a local news alert, reporting that a stolen car linked to the gang had been recovered nearby. Police officers were questioning witnesses, and rumors were spreading through the town faster than wildfire. Everyone wanted to know who these criminals were and why they had targeted Daniel. Some speculated that it was random violence. Others whispered about deeper motives. What no one realized was that this incident would ripple far beyond the confines of their small community. Later, that day as Daniel limped into work, people greeted him with concerned expressions. "Are you okay?" asked Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman whose car he had fixed just last week. She handed him a thermos filled with hot tea. "We heard what happened. Those thugs won't get away with it." Daniel forced a smile, though his mind was elsewhere. He thanked her politely and went about his usual tasks, pretending nothing was wrong. But inside, his thoughts churned. He knew that running away wasn't an option anymore. Not this time. If he wanted justice, not just for himself, but for everyone else who might suffer at the hands of those men, he needed to confront the truth head-on. And that meant revisiting a chapter of his life he had sworn never to open again. That evening, as Daniel sat alone in his apartment nursing a cup of coffee, there was a knock at the door. At first he froze, wondering if the gang had returned to finish what they started. But when he peered through the peephole, he saw a figure that made his heart skip a beat. Standing outside was Gregory, his estranged uncle, a man Daniel hadn't seen in over a decade. Gregory looked exactly as Daniel remembered him, tall, impeccably dressed, and exuding an air of authority that commanded respect. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his tailored suit gleamed under the dim hallway light. For a moment, Daniel considered ignoring the knock altogether, but curiosity, or perhaps fate, got the better of him, and he opened the door cautiously. "Daniel," Gregory said, his voice calm yet commanding. "May I come in?" Without waiting for an answer, Gregory stepped inside, brushing past Daniel with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He glanced around the modest apartment, taking in its sparse furnishings and lack of luxury. Then turning to Daniel, he gave him a long, appraising look. Finally he spoke. "You've changed." "And you haven't," Daniel replied dryly, closing the door behind him. Despite the years apart, there was still a strange familiarity between them, like two pieces of a puzzle that fit together despite their differences. "What do you want, Gregory?" Gregory sighed, pulling out a chair and sitting down without being invited. "I assume you've heard about the troublemakers. In town, the ones who attacked you." Daniel nodded stiffly. "What about them?" "They're not just your problem anymore," Gregory continued, folding his hands on the table. "They're ours. Or rather mine. And yours, soon enough." Daniel frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Gregory leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto Daniel's. "Let me explain something. You think you've escaped your past, but the truth is, the past has a way of catching up with us all. Right now, our family's empire is teetering on the brink of collapse. Corruption scandals, internal power struggles, and dissatisfied shareholders. It's chaos. The board is desperate for new leadership, someone untainted by scandal who can restore order. He paused, letting his words sink in. And guess who they've chosen? You, Daniel. You're the only one left who can fix this mess. For a moment, Daniel could only stare at him, stunned. The idea was absurd. How could they possibly expect him, a mechanic who had spent years hiding from the world, to step into such a role? No, he said firmly, shaking his head. I'm not interested. Find someone else. But Gregory wasn't deterred. You don't understand, he pressed. This isn't just about fixing cars anymore. This is about fixing lives, businesses, entire communities. You have the skills, the intelligence, and the integrity we need. Besides, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Do you really want to let those thugs win? To see them walk free while innocent people suffer because of their actions? Daniel clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. He hated how Gregory always managed to twist situations to his advantage. Yet, deep down, he knew there was some truth in his uncle's words. If he refused, he'd be turning his back, not only on his own potential, but also on the chance to make a real difference. What's the catch? Daniel asked finally, narrowing his eyes. There's always a catch with you. Gregory smiled faintly, almost admiringly. Just one condition, he admitted. If you agree to take over, I'll ensure those men who hurt you face the full force of the law. No loopholes, no excuses. Justice will be served. It was a tempting offer, one that struck a chord deep within Daniel. For years he had tried to live a quiet, blameless life, avoiding conflict and drama, but now faced with the opportunity to reclaim control, not just of his destiny but of the system itself, he couldn't help but feel drawn to the challenge. Maybe this was his chance to rewrite the story, to prove that he wasn't the same person he used to be. Fine, Daniel said after a long silence. I'll meet with the board, but if I agree to this, it's on my terms, not yours. Gregory nodded, clearly satisfied. Of course, he said smoothly. Welcome back, Daniel. As Gregory left, Daniel stood by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon. The weight of what he had agreed to hung heavy on his shoulders, but beneath it was a spark of determination. The men who had underestimated him would soon learn their mistake, and Daniel? He was ready to show them and the world exactly who he truly was. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling like he was walking into a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The weight of his decision pressed down on him as he prepared for the meeting with the board. For years, he had avoided anything that even remotely resembled responsibility or power. And yet here he was, about to step back into a world he had sworn never to return to. It wasn't excitement that drove him forward. It was something deeper, a mix of anger, determination, and an unshakable sense of justice. Gregory had arranged everything. A car waited outside Daniel's apartment at exactly 8 a.m., sleek and polished, its engine purring softly. The driver held the door open for him without saying a word, and Daniel slid into the back seat, clutching a folder filled with notes Gregory had given him the night before. As the car pulled away from the curb, Daniel stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of his small town blur past. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever be able to come back to this simple life again. The drive to the city took nearly 2 hours, during which Daniel tried to steady his nerves. The towering skyscrapers began to appear in the distance, their glass facades reflecting the early morning sunlight. When they finally arrived at the headquarters, a massive building that dominated the skyline, Daniel felt his stomach tighten. This was no ordinary office. It was a fortress of wealth and influence, a place where decisions made behind closed doors could ripple across industries and nations. Inside, the lobby was bustling with activity. Employees in sharp suits hurried past, exchanging clipped greetings and tapping away on their phones. Daniel followed Gregory toward the elevators, feeling increasingly out of place in his worn jacket and scuffed boots. The elevator ride to the top floor felt endless, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, the doors opened, revealing a long hallway lined with portraits of previous leaders. At the end stood double oak doors engraved with the company's emblem. This is it, Gregory said quietly, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Remember, you're not just representing yourself. You're representing everyone who's counting on you. Daniel nodded, though his throat felt dry. As the doors swung open, he stepped into a grand conference room where a group of impeccably dressed men and women sat around a large table. They turned to look at him as he entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Gregory introduced him briefly before taking a seat, leaving Daniel standing alone at the head of the table. "Good morning," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I know you've all been briefed about me, but let me say this up front. I'm not here because I want to be. I'm here because I believe change is necessary, not just for this company, but for the people it affects." There was a moment of stunned silence followed by murmurs of approval. One of the board members, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and piercing eyes, leaned forward. "Mr. Hartley," she said, using his surname for the first time, "we admire your honesty, but can you handle the pressure? Leading a corporation of this magnitude requires more than good intentions." "I understand that," Daniel replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. "And I won't pretend I have all the answers. What I do have is integrity, vision, and a willingness to learn. If you give me a chance, I'll prove myself." His words resonated with some of the board members while others remained unconvinced. A balding man with a thick accent spoke up next. "What about the scandals plaguing us right now? How do you plan to address those?" Daniel took a deep breath. He had thought long and hard about this question. "Transparency," he said firmly. "We need to own our mistakes, apologize sincerely, and implement systems to prevent them from happening again. People respect honesty, even when it's uncomfortable." The room buzzed with quiet conversation as the board members exchanged glances. Some nodded approvingly, while others scribbled notes furiously. After nearly an hour of grilling questions, the tone shifted. Slowly but surely, Daniel began to win them over, not through flashy promises or empty rhetoric, but through genuine conviction and practical solutions. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The same skeptical faces that had greeted him earlier now wore expressions of cautious optimism. When the vote came, it was unanimous. Daniel would take over as the new chief executive officer. Applause broke out, echoing off the walls of the EO conference room. Gregory gave him a rare smile, clearly pleased with how things had turned out. But Daniel didn't feel triumphant. Instead, he felt the full weight of what lay ahead. As he left the building later that afternoon, Gregory walked beside him, offering advice and outlining immediate priorities. "You'll need to assemble a team you trust," Gregory said. "People who share your values and aren't afraid to challenge you when necessary." "I already know one thing," Daniel replied, his jaw tightening slightly. "Those men who attacked me, they're going to pay. No delays, no excuses. Make sure the authorities are ready to act." Gregory raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Consider it done." Over the following days, Daniel threw himself into work, immersing himself in reports, financial statements, and operational strategies. He spent countless hours learning the ins and outs of the company, identifying areas that needed reform. His mechanic's mindset served him well. Just as he approached broken cars with precision and care, he tackled problems within the company methodically, piece by piece. At the same time, he kept tabs on the investigation into the gang. Thanks to Gregory's connections, law enforcement moved swiftly. Evidence linking the men to various crimes poured in: stolen vehicles, illegal weapons, drug trafficking operations. By the end of the week, warrants were issued, and arrests began. News of the crackdown spread quickly, reaching Daniel's hometown. People whispered about the mysterious figure who had orchestrated it all. Few knew the truth, that it was Daniel, the quiet mechanic who had once blended into the background. To them, he was still the same unassuming man who fixed their cars and kept to himself. But soon enough, they would see him for who he truly was. As Daniel sat in his new office late one night, staring out at the glittering cityscape below, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He hadn't chosen this path, But now that he was on it, he refused to falter. The men who had underestimated him would soon realize their mistake. And Daniel? He was ready to show them, and the world, that power wielded with purpose could reshape everything. As the weeks passed, Daniel settled into his role as the new chief executive officer of the company. At first it felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. Every day brought new challenges, from managing high-stakes meetings to navigating complex corporate politics. But Daniel approached everything with the same calm determination that had defined him as a mechanic. He didn't rush or panic. Instead, he observed, analyzed, and acted decisively. One of the first things Daniel did was clean house. The company had been plagued by corruption for years, and many senior executives were complicit in unethical practices. Daniel wasted no time identifying those who resisted change or prioritized profit over integrity. Some left voluntarily when they realized their days of unchecked power were over. Others were quietly dismissed after discreet investigations revealed their misconduct. It wasn't personal, it was business. Daniel made sure everyone understood that moving forward, honesty and accountability would be non-negotiable. Despite these sweeping changes, not everyone welcomed Daniel's leadership. A small but vocal faction within the board remained resistant, clinging to the old ways. They argued that Daniel's reforms were too drastic, claiming they would hurt profits and alienate shareholders. Privately, they grumbled about how he was too idealistic and out of touch. These dissenters underestimated him, thinking he was naive because of his humble background. What they failed to realize was that Daniel had spent years studying people, their strengths, weaknesses, and motivations. He knew exactly how to handle them. The tension came to a head during a heated board meeting. One of the most vocal critics, a man named Richard, stood up and addressed the room. "I understand the need for reform," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "But we can't afford to lose sight of our bottom line. Shareholders are already questioning your decisions, Mr. Hartley. If this continues, I fear we'll see a mass exodus." Daniel listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Richard finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then Daniel rose from his seat, his presence commanding attention. "Thank you for your concerns, Richard," he said calmly. "But let me clarify something. Profit isn't the problem, it's greed. For too long, this company has sacrificed ethics for short-term gains. That ends now." He walked to the front of the room and pressed a button on a remote control. A projector screen descended from the ceiling, displaying graphs and charts detailing the company's recent performance. "Here's what you're missing," Daniel continued. "Yes, profits dipped slightly last quarter, but customer loyalty increased by 15%. Brand reputation soared after we launched community outreach programs. And employee satisfaction? Up by 20%. These aren't just numbers. They represent real people whose lives we've improved." The room fell silent as Daniel spoke. His voice carried authority, but it also held conviction, a quality that couldn't be faked. He went on to explain how sustainable growth was achievable without compromising values. By investing in ethical practices, the company could build trust, attract loyal customers, and ultimately secure long-term success. When he finished, several board members nodded approvingly. Even some of Richard's allies seemed swayed. But the battle wasn't over yet. Behind closed doors, whispers of rebellion continued. The dissenters plotted, hoping to undermine Daniel's efforts and restore the status quo. Little did they know Daniel was always one step ahead. Meanwhile, justice was being served elsewhere. Thanks to Gregory's influence and Daniel's insistence, law enforcement moved swiftly against the gang responsible for attacking him. Arrests were made, and evidence piled up until the case became impossible to ignore. News outlets covered the story extensively, painting the gang as ruthless criminals who preyed on innocent people. In town, residents cheered openly, relieved to see such dangerous individuals brought to justice. Word eventually reached the gang members themselves. From their jail cells, they pieced together the truth, that the unassuming mechanic they had, beaten and mocked, was now a powerful figure, capable of dismantling their entire operation. Fear replaced arrogance as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. They had picked the wrong man to mess with. Back at the company, Daniel faced another challenge. Despite his successes, rumors of internal resistance persisted. To address this, he called an emergency meeting with all department heads. Standing before them, he didn't mince words. "I know some of you don't agree with my methods," he admitted. "That's fine. We're allowed to disagree. But here's what I won't tolerate: sabotage. If anyone tries to undermine this company or its values, they'll answer to me directly." His warning sent a clear message. Those who had doubted him began to see him in a new light, not as a pushover, but as a leader who demanded respect and earned it through action. Slowly but surely, opposition faded, replaced by cautious cooperation. Daniel also took steps to ensure transparency extended beyond the boardroom. He implemented policies that encouraged employees to report unethical behavior without fear of retaliation. Anonymous tip lines were set up and regular audits became standard practice. This culture shift didn't happen overnight, but over time it transformed the company from within. Amidst all this, Daniel never lost sight of why he had agreed to take on this role. It wasn't for fame, wealth, or power. It was for justice. Whether it was holding corrupt executives accountable or ensuring criminals faced consequences, Daniel remained steadfast in his mission. He refused to let anyone exploit the system again, least of all himself. Late one evening, as Daniel sat alone in his office reviewing reports, he reflected on how far he'd come. Just months ago, he had been an ordinary mechanic living a quiet life. Now he was leading one of the most influential companies in the world. Yet despite the accolades and newfound authority, he still saw himself as the same person he had always been. A man committed to doing what was right, no matter the cost. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled like stars. Somewhere out there, the men who had attacked him sat in jail, regretting their choices. Elsewhere, employees worked late hours, inspired by the changes Daniel had championed. And somewhere deep inside, Daniel felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He hadn't sought revenge or glory. He had simply turned the tables, proving that true strength lies not in dominance but in purpose. Months had passed since Daniel took over as the chief executive officer, and the transformation within the company was undeniable. What had once been a symbol of greed and corruption was now earning praise for its ethical practices and community-focused initiatives. Employees who had once feared retaliation for speaking out were now empowered to voice their opinions. Customers trusted the brand again, knowing that their loyalty was valued more than their wallets. Even shareholders began to see the benefits of sustainable growth as profits stabilized and public perception improved. But Daniel knew better than to rest on his laurels. He understood that change wasn't something you achieved overnight. It required constant vigilance, effort, and adaptation. So every morning he arrived at the office early, ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. His mechanic's mindset served him well. Just as he used to fix broken engines piece by piece, he approached problems in the company with patience and precision. One day, as Daniel sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports, there was a knock at the door. It was Gregory, his estranged uncle. Over the past few months, their relationship had shifted from strained to cautiously respectful. Though they still didn't see eye to eye on everything, Gregory couldn't deny the impact Daniel had made. "You've done well," Gregory said, taking a seat across from Daniel. "Better than I expected." "Thanks," Daniel replied, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "But we're not done yet." Gregory chuckled softly. "Always. Thinking ahead, aren't you? That's good, but listen, I came here today because there's something else you should know." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "There's talk among the board members," Gregory continued. "Some are starting to question whether you'll stick around long term. They're worried you might leave once things stabilize." Daniel leaned back in his chair considering this. He had thought about it himself. What would happen when the dust settled? Could he return to the quiet life he had once cherished, The truth was he didn't know. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't abandon the company while it still needed him. "Tell them this," Daniel said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere until the job is finished." Gregory nodded, satisfied with the answer. As he left, Daniel turned his attention back to the reports, but his mind kept wandering to the bigger picture. How could he ensure that the changes he had implemented would last beyond his tenure? The answer, he realized, lay in the people, the employees, customers, and communities who depended on the company. If he could inspire them to carry the torch, then his work would endure. A few weeks later, Daniel called a company-wide meeting. All employees gathered in the auditorium, curious about what their CEO had to say. When Daniel stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. He looked out at the sea of faces, many of whom he recognized from late-night brainstorming sessions or casual conversations in the hallway. These were the people who had helped turn the tide, who had embraced his vision and worked tirelessly to make it a reality. "I want to start by thanking all of you," Daniel began, his voice steady but warm. "None of this would have been possible without your hard work and dedication. Together, we've accomplished incredible things. We've rebuilt trust, restored integrity, and created opportunities for growth, not just for ourselves, but for the communities we serve." The audience erupted into applause, but Daniel held up a hand to quiet them. "However," he continued, "our journey isn't over. There will always be challenges, always be obstacles. My goal has never been to create a perfect company. It's to build a foundation strong enough to withstand whatever comes next." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then with a deep breath, he added, "That's why I need each of you to take ownership of this mission. This isn't my company, it's ours. And if we truly believe in the values we've fought so hard to establish, then it's our responsibility to protect them." By the time Daniel finished speaking, the room was buzzing with energy. Employees exchanged excited glances inspired by his words. For the first time, they felt like true stakeholders, not just cogs in a machine, but vital parts of something meaningful. Outside the company, Daniel's influence continued to ripple outward. The gang responsible for attacking him had been sentenced to lengthy prison terms, their crimes exposed to the world. In town, residents spoke openly about how Daniel had changed their lives, not only by bringing justice but also by proving that even the most ordinary-seeming person could rise to extraordinary heights. One evening, as Daniel walked through the forest behind his house, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the men who had underestimated him, the board members who had doubted him, and the countless others who had stood by him along the way. Most of all, he thought about the choices he had made, the decision to step out of the shadows, to confront his past and to fight for a better future. For so long, Daniel had carried the weight of his secrets, believing that hiding was the safest option. But now he realized that safety was an illusion. True strength came not from avoiding conflict, but from facing it head-on. By embracing his identity and using his power for good, Daniel had transformed not only the company but also himself. He stood beneath the stars, listening to the rustle of leaves in the wind. Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of peace. He didn't know what the future held, whether he would stay at the helm of the company or eventually pass the torch to someone else. But one thing was clear: he had made a difference. And perhaps in doing so, he had finally found redemption. Years later, when people told the story of Daniel Hartley, they didn't focus on his wealth or title. Instead, they remembered him as a man who had risen from humble beginnings to become a beacon of hope and change. They talked about how he had turned the tables on those who sought to harm him, proving that kindness and integrity could triumph over cruelty and greed. They marveled at how he had used his position not for personal gain, but to uplift others. And though Daniel never sought recognition, he couldn't help but smile whenever he heard these stories. Because in the end, it wasn't the titles or accolades that mattered. It was the lives he had touched, the wrongs he had righted, and the legacy he had built. A legacy built not on fear or domination, but on purpose, compassion, and unwavering resolve.